Hello and welcome to this video presentation. My name is Paul Brett. I'm a Senior Software Support Analyst supporting HCL Integration Platform. Today's topic is using the Azure SQL adapter with HIP. So let's kick off this demonstration at the Azure Portal. The application I'm going to run today is SQL Servers. Within the SQL Servers application, I created a SQL Server instance called HCL-Azure-SQL-1. From within this instance, I created a SQL database. If we click on SQL databases here, you will see I've got a database HCL-database-1. During the creation of this database, I was prompted to create a user ID and a password. The user ID I chose was HCL-admin. Within the database, we can click on connection strings here, and for several connecting applications, a connection string is shown that contains many of the details we will require when we design our map later on to connect to and retrieve information from the database. I'm going to go into Query Editor here, and I'm going to need to log in. I'm going to close the query one that's been automatically created and open a pre-designed query that I did earlier. Okay. This is my query, and I ran various entries to drop a table called test1 if it existed, create a table test1 and populate it with 2 rows of data. I'm going to run the query to select all the rows from test1, and you will note that the job has run and 2 rows have been retrieved, Paul and Charlotte. Okay, so that's the basics of the database. Let's move on to the HCL Design Server. Here we are at the HCL Integration Platform, or HIP, Design Server login screen. And I'm going to log in, and as you see I have no projects currently. I'm going to build this project from scratch. So let's start with creating a project. Okay, so we have a project now called HCL Azure SQL. We'll go into there, and the first thing I'm going to do is create a general purpose utility schema so that I've got a text blob to work with in my first map. I'm going to call it generic. I am going to add a text item, and that is it. We are done with that schema for now. Okay, let's go on to mapping. Let's create a new map. Let's call this map test1. Okay, this map is going to have just a simple output card for the moment. I'm going to call the output card out1. I'm going to use the file adapter. I'm going to write to a file called output.txt. And finally, the schema I'm going to use is the one that I just created, text item within generic. Okay, so we have our map. The rule I'm going to paste in from something I pre-prepared. This string in the connection part of my get is culled from the connection string that we saw in the Azure console earlier, the Azure Portal. So we have our SQL instance, we have our database name, the port is the default but does need to be specified, we have our user, we have our password, our schema is DBO because I've only created the one user, our table is test1, and these other option items are required, QTY1, LSN0 and AS0, -T gives us a trace if something goes wrong. Okay. I've put last error message on the end there because it captures anything that went wrong with maybe my adapter command string. So let's pop that in there and save that map, and then we build that map and we run that map. Fantastic. This gives us the output data, 2 rows that we inserted in the previous section. So fantastic, this map works. Okay, that's all well and good, but let's say we want to create a traditional style map where the input card is the one retrieving the data. So let's try that now. From the Maps menu, we'll go for New. We'll go Test 2. Okay. Let's create a new input card this time. We'll call it In1. We're going to use the Azure SQL adapter. Server name. Now let's paste in my entire string and just cut out the bit that we need. Server name is, oops, too many characters, HCL blah 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 .net. So that entire thing. The port can remain the same. The database, I'm going to paste my string in again and cut out what I don't need. HCL-database-1. My user is HCL-admin. My password. And I'm going to click the test button here to make sure we've got a connection. Connection established successfully. This is good. Let's click next. Okay, we're going to get the information from a query. Our query we're going to type in as select star from test 1. Quite simple, but that will do for now. Click next. And I'm not actually going to pick one of the schemas that I've got already because I don't have one. I'm going to click the generate button. And now it has generated the type tree for me, test2_in1, and it's picked the appropriate item for me already, row set. And now I click the OK button, and that's my input card created. Let's just add that to the canvas just to show you the structure a bit better. Okay, so it's the main item has infinite rows, each of which can contain 3 columns. It's exactly what we expect. So let's create an output card now. We're going to call this output card out1. Next. We are going to use the file adapter. Next. We are going to write to output.txt. Next. And for the schema, I'm going to use exactly the same schema that we've used on input. Row set. There we go. Click OK. Okay, so on output we have the same structure. Now we need to do some mapping rules. Let's add in1 back to the canvas. So I'm going to drag row to row, and that would actually work, but let's assume that the input structure and the output structure are different, and because they're different you would have to drop to a functional map. So I'm just going to do that now, equals f underscore each row. So, and it's prompting me, do I want to create that functional map? So I'm going to go with yes. Then within the functional map, I'm not going to do anything special. I'm just going to do everybody's name. I'm going to do everybody's age and their start date. Let's just pop those open so you can see them. And there we go, that's the functional map. Let's hit the save button on that and close it. Test 2 is ready to go. I'm going to click on build. Build successfully. And I'm going to click on run. Run successful. So let's look at the output card here. View data. Great, the same 2 rows. So that's how to build a map and generate the type tree on the fly from an Azure SQL connection. All well and good. Let's try and insert some data. So let's leave test 2 open for the moment and build a new map called test 3. Okay, so I'm going to create an output structure here. Out1, next. I am going to use the Azure SQL adapter on output. Next. Okay, server name. Let's pop that back in there. Oops, too many characters again. Port can stay the same. Database, let's type that in, HCL database 1 because it's quicker. HCL admin and password. I could click the test button here again, but I'm not going to because I know that's all correct. Okay, so I'm going to insert into a table. For the schema, I can click the fetch button here, and in theory it should go and fetch all the available schema. I want to use DBO. I can click Fetch on the tables for DBO now, and in theory it should bring in my test 1, which it does. Great. And everything else can remain the same. I'm going to click Next. Now I can reuse the schema that I generated for the query before, and it should work, but I'm not going to risk it. I'm just going to hit the Generate button and get a completely new schema for this output card. Test 3 out, row set. Very good. Click the OK button. Let's expand that. Okay, so I could insert rows using this structure. I'm going to insert one fixed row, so let's just pop none into this entry here. How do we do that? That button there. No, that's popped it in the wrong place. So let's try that again. Let's just type it manually, it's easier. Right, okay, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an index to create a fixed row that I'm going to insert. And I'm going to populate this with fixed values. So let's start with a name. Let's go with an age. And let's stick in an employee start date. Let's not stick in an actual date. Let's use a function. Let's use current date, and hopefully that will work. So let's build map. It's been built successfully, so that's a good sign. Let's hit the run button. The map has completed successfully. Great. So this map has inserted another row, a third row for me, for the user Megan. So let's go back to test 2 and rerun this map. If you remember before, it brought back 2 rows. If I rerun it now, in theory, it should bring back 3 rows, which it does. Fantastic. So there we go. That's how to use the design server to connect with, insert data to and retrieve data from Azure SQL. Okay, so let's enhance our test 3 example. Our test 3 example is not very useful at the moment because it only inserts a fixed row of data and needs to be compiled every time those values change. So let's have an input structure where we can change those at will, and let's also set this so that it can be run from the REST API. So the first thing to do is to delete the index, and let's next create an input structure. Let's save that for the moment. Schema first. Let's grab a schema. Here's a schema I created earlier. I'll have a quick look at that. Input XSD. Let's actually open it to look at it. Okay, that's fine. And let's bring in a file that I created earlier as well. Input XML. XML. There we go. Okay, so let's create a new structure here using that schema. So let's call this in1. Next. Use existing connection. No. Go for file. Next. The file we're going to read is input XML. I'm going to turn on the REST input flag here as well, ready for later when we do deploy this via the REST API. Let's click Next. Schema. Let's go for input. Select the type. It's XSD. And schema customization, I won't change that for the moment. Okay, let's add our input structure to the canvas. Hopefully we can see that within global, within root, there is a repeating sequence of rows here. And then within rows we've got name, age and employee start date. So I'm going to drag row to row, and then I'm going to modify this to call instead a functional map equals f underscore each XML row. I'm not going to use each row again because we'll use that already and it would cause confusion. Let's create the map f underscore each XML row, yes, and then in the functional map it's quite simple. We're just going to map name to name, age to age, and emp state to emp state, start date. Okay, so that's that map is finished. Let's click the save button, Close that. Test 3 is ready to run. So I do have an input.xml. It does have an additional person in there. I think I called him Steve. We quickly go back to our database and into our query editor. Oops, need to log back in again. And we'll just check that the table contains the 3 rows from earlier. Select star from test 1. Click the run button. Right, we've got 3 rows. Paul, Charlotte and Megan are in there. So let's run our test 3 map now. Build first and then run. The run is complete successfully. We'll go back to our database, rerun the query, and we should now have Steve. Steve has been injected. Steve is 32 years old, and I use the current date function again to insert Steve's start date. Actually, no, I didn't. I made one up. I put one in the XML, 2018, October the 15th. Okay, so all well and good. So this map, test 3, should now be callable from the REST API. So let's give that a go. I'm going to close that, go to home. Actually, there's one more file we need to import before we can create the package. Let's look in files. We've only got the input file at the moment. We are going to also need the schema to deploy in the package. So let's browse for and grab a copy of that. Okay, in files now we have the schema. That's great. Let's go back to home and create our package. Okay, let's create a new one. Let's call this package 1. And from our project, we choose a project. From that project we pick the map and the schema file to deploy. Okay, before I deploy this package, let's bring up the API endpoints and show that they're currently there's nothing there. So let's bring up hip rest, ensure the API is up. It is good. So let's go to the endpoints URL, and as you can see, there are currently no URL endpoints defined. Back to the design server, and let's go for the deploy option. I've got the previously configured local REST API server. I'm going to choose package 1 and I'm going to hit deploy. The deploy is happening, the deploy is successful. Okay, back on the endpoints, you will note that there is now an API endpoint deployed. Test 3 can be run asynchronously or synchronously. We're going to run it right now synchronously. We are going to change the input type to text. We're going to edit this string and we're going to put in some alternative XML there. Before we do that, let's just remind ourselves, on the database we have query 1, select star from test 1, run. We have the Paul, Charlotte and Megan rows. I've removed Steve, he's gone. So in our Swagger UI, let's go and insert the XML to reinsert Steve. So we need the XML from here. Paste that in. Okay, so here we have Steve, 32, and his start date. Well, let's say Steve isn't 32, we made a mistake. Let's say Steve is 42, just to show that the alternative value goes in. It's not the compiled in one from the XML. Actually, let's change his name as well. Let's call this Diana. Diana, 42, same start date. Let's go for that. Okay, let's execute. It reports that the map has completed successfully. And if we look on our query and run that, we should see Diana has been inserted. So there we go. We can override the XML on calling the REST API and inject data into Azure SQL. So here's the appropriate curl command to do exactly the same thing. So let's take a copy of that into our clipboard. Go to the command prompt and paste that in. Let's get rid of that. Paste that in, and we get the opportunity to edit the XML at the command prompt. So let's put a new person in here now. Let's put in Gemma. get rid of Diana. Okay, let's say Gemma is a nice young fresh-faced 18 and she joined the company today. 07. Okay, so let's insert Gemma into the Azure database. So there we go, the REST API call is completed. Back in the database query, if we run now, we should see that Gemma has been inserted, and there we go, there's Gemma. That's using the REST API to insert data, both using the Swagger page and using a curl call. I want to thank you all for taking the time to view my video presentation today. If you found the content interesting and informative, please remember to hit that like button, and I would very much like it if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.